I sold my late husband's old suitcase for $15. But a week later, the buyer called. "Ma'am, did you know there was a false bottom inside?" I had no idea. Under it was $2 million in cash. When I arrived, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Collins. Most people who know me call me Maggie, and for 57 years that name has meant something simple and decent. A woman who taught third grade for 23 years, who baked lemon pound cake for the church bake sale, who watered her neighbors' petunias when they went on vacation. I was never remarkable. I never wanted to be. I had my house on Clover Street in Marietta, Georgia, my garden, my Tuesday book club, and Richard. Richard Collins was my husband for 31 years. He died 8 months ago. A heart attack, the doctors said. Sudden, massive, no warning. He was sitting in his recliner watching the evening news, and by the time I walked back from the kitchen with his glass of sweet tea, he was already gone. That is the image I have tried hardest to unsee. The glass still cold in my hand, the television murmuring about the weather forecast, and Richard perfectly still in a way he had never been still in all the years I'd known him. Grief is a strange country. You think you know its borders, and then you find yourself in rooms you didn't expect. The weeks after the funeral were consumed by paperwork and silence. Richard had handled the finances, always had from the very beginning of our marriage. I knew we were comfortable. We owned the house outright, had a decent savings account, and Richard had a small pension from his years as a regional sales manager. Nothing extravagant, a modest, honest life. That was what I believed. It was his brother Dale who first made me feel uncertain about that belief. Dale Collins is 4 years younger than Richard was. Where Richard was quiet and methodical, Dale has always been loud and restless, a man who smells of ambition and old spice in equal measure. His wife Sandra is the kind of woman who smiles with her mouth while her eyes are doing arithmetic. I never disliked them exactly, but I had never fully trusted them either, a feeling I always dismissed as uncharitable. Dale called me 3 days after the funeral. "Maggie," he said, his voice thick with performed sorrow, "I just want you to know I'm here for you. Richard would have wanted that. And listen, when you're ready to sort through his things, I'd like to be involved. Some of those old items might have sentimental family value." Sentimental family value. I remember turning that phrase over in my mind. At the time, I said only, "Of course, Dale. Thank you." I assumed he meant the hunting rifle, or maybe their father's old pocket watch. I didn't think about the suitcase. The suitcase had lived in the back of the upstairs closet for as long as I could remember. A large, old-fashioned brown Samsonite with brass clasps, the kind nobody manufactures anymore. Richard had brought it into the marriage, a relic from some earlier chapter of his life that he never elaborated on. I had asked about it twice over the years. He said it was from a business trip. He said it was empty. I believed him, because I believed him about everything, because that is what 31 years of ordinary trust looks like. I decided to hold a garage sale in early October, 6 weeks after the funeral. The grief counselor my daughter had insisted I see said it was healthy to reclaim my space. I moved through the house with a kind of numb practicality, tagging items with little orange stickers. Richard's golf clubs, $40. A box of paperback novels, $2. 3 sport coats he never wore, $5 each. The Samsonite I tagged at $15. A man named Tom Whitaker bought it on a Saturday morning. He was perhaps 60, a retired high school principal from Kennesaw, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a quiet, careful manner. He examined the clasps, pressed the lid, declared it solid construction, and paid me 3 $5 bills without haggling. We shook hands. He loaded it into his Subaru. I watched him drive away and felt nothing in particular. That was the last moment of my old life. 1 week later, on a Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer. "Mrs. Collins?" A man's voice, deliberate, slightly formal. "My name is Tom Whitaker. We met at your garage sale. I purchased a large brown suitcase." "Yes, I remember," I said. "Is something wrong with it?" A pause. The kind of pause that changes things. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I don't quite know how to ask this, but I need to. Did your husband ever mention that the suitcase had a false bottom?" I sat down on the kitchen stool without meaning to. "I'm sorry," I said. "Mrs. Collins, I discovered it by accident. I was cleaning the lining and the whole panel lifted. There is a compartment underneath." Another pause. "There is a very large amount of cash inside. I have not touched it. I have not told anyone, but I felt that you needed to know." I didn't speak for a long moment. Through the kitchen window, I could see my neighbor's oak tree, the late afternoon light cutting through the leaves in long golden lines, everything perfectly ordinary. "How much?" I finally asked. His voice was quiet and absolutely serious. "From what I can see, Mrs. Collins, it looks like $2 million. I sat on that kitchen stool for a very long time after the call ended. Tom Whitaker had been brief and careful. He said he would keep the suitcase exactly as he found it, locked in his spare bedroom until he heard from me. He said he was not a man who took things that weren't his. He said, and this was the part I kept returning to, "I thought you deserved the truth, whatever that truth turns out to be." Then he gave me his address in Kennesaw and said I could come whenever I was ready. I stared at the wall. Outside, a car rolled slowly down Clover Street. A dog barked twice and stopped. $2 million. Where does a retired regional sales manager from Marietta, Georgia, get $2 million in cash? You don't put $2 million in a suitcase if it came from somewhere clean. You don't hide it under a false bottom if you have nothing to hide. And you don't keep it from your wife of 31 years if you trust her completely. That last thought was the one that cut deepest. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and tried to reconstruct the man I thought I'd known. Richard Collins. Methodical, quiet, devoted, or so I had believed, to routine. He worked for the same regional distribution company for 19 years. He came home for dinner. He coached Little League when our son Daniel was small. He never spent extravagantly. He drove a 4-year-old Buick. None of it made sense. And yet, the longer I lay there, the more small things began to resurface. Things I had dismissed at the time as irrelevant, or none of my business, or simply Richard being Richard. The phone calls he took in the garage, door closed. I'd assumed it was Dale. The brothers were always conspiring over some football pool or other. The 2 weeks every year when he traveled to regional conferences and came back looking not tired, but tightly wound, as if he'd been holding his breath the whole time. The single occasion, perhaps 12 years ago, when I found a second cell phone in his coat pocket, a cheap prepaid thing, and he told me it was for work, a backup, and I accepted that without pressing further. Had I been naive, or had I simply chosen not to look? By 4 a.m, I had made myself 1 cup of chamomile tea and faced the thing directly. My husband had kept a profound secret from me. That secret involved $2 million in cash hidden in a suitcase, and Dale Collins had called me 3 days after the funeral asking to be involved in sorting through Richard's things. Dale knew. I was almost certain of it. Maybe not the exact amount, maybe not the exact location, but Dale knew something. That telephone call after the funeral was not about sentiment. I thought about calling my daughter, Brenna. I picked up the phone twice and set it down again. Brenna was 33, a nurse in Charlotte, practical and loving, but she would panic. She would want to involve everyone immediately, lawyers, police, family, and I needed to think before I involved anyone. I thought about calling Daniel, my son, but Daniel was overseas with his company in Germany, and I didn't want to alarm him without knowing what I was dealing with. What I needed first was information, and to get information, I needed to go to Kennesaw. I drove to Tom Whitaker's house on a Friday morning, telling no one where I was going. His home was a neat brick ranch on a cul-de-sac, a bird bath in the front yard, American flag on the porch. He opened the door before I could knock. He must have seen me pull in, and shook my hand with the seriousness of a man who understood the weight of what he was holding for me. He led me to the spare bedroom. The suitcase was on the bed, open, just as he'd described. He had folded back the fabric lining panel to expose the false bottom. A flat wooden board, perhaps a half-inch thick, fitted so precisely you would never have felt it by pressing on the lid. Beneath it, wrapped in plastic, were stacks of bills, hundreds mostly, rubber-banded in thick bundles, the smell of old paper and something dry and slightly chemical. I stood there with my hands at my sides and looked at it. I counted as best I could without disturbing anything, Tom said quietly from behind me. Approximately 2,140,000. I thanked him. I told him I needed a few days to decide what to do and that he had done a profoundly decent thing. He nodded. He offered me coffee. I declined. I drove home on the interstate with both hands on the wheel and my mind working with a cold clarity I had never felt before. Here was the shape of my problem. The money's origin was unknown and almost certainly illegal, which meant that claiming it was not a simple matter of walking to a bank. The law in Georgia regarding found property, abandoned property, and estates was complex. If I reported it directly to the police without counsel, I could lose control of it entirely, or worse, become implicated in whatever Richard had been doing. If Dale Collins had any claim to it, or thought he did, he would move the moment he suspected I'd found it. I could not be passive. Being passive was what I had been for 31 years. Look where that had gotten me. My first plan was modest, precise, and completely private. I needed a lawyer, not the family attorney who had handled Richard's will, who knew Dale, but someone new, someone entirely mine. And I needed to understand exactly what was in that suitcase before anyone else moved. I opened my laptop that evening and began searching for estate and probate attorneys in Atlanta who specialized in complex asset cases. I found a woman named Patricia Holt, a partner at a firm in Buckhead with 20 years of experience. Her photograph showed a composed woman in her 50s with reading glasses and an expression that suggested she had heard everything and remained unimpressed by all of it. I called her office Monday morning at 9 o'clock precisely. It was the first decision I had ever made completely on my own. Patricia Holt's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building on Peachtree Road, with a view of the Atlanta skyline and the kind of quiet that money buys. Thick carpet, no echoes, a receptionist who spoke in a register just above a whisper. I wore my good gray blazer. I had brought a legal pad and a pen because writing things down had always helped me think. Patricia was exactly as her photograph suggested, composed, precise, and unhurried. She listened to the full account without interrupting. Richard's death, the garage sale, Tom Whitaker's call, the cash in the false bottom, and when I finished, she took off her reading glasses, set them on the desk, and looked at me directly. "All right," she said. "The first thing I want to tell you is that you have not broken any law. The second thing is that what you do next will determine a great deal about what happens to that money. The third thing is that you were right not to touch it." She explained the legal landscape carefully. Because Richard had died intestate regarding any undisclosed assets, his will covered the house, the savings, the pension, but naturally made no mention of hidden cash. The money existed in a legally ambiguous space. It was potentially part of his estate, which made me, as his surviving spouse, the primary heir. But the origin of the funds was the critical unknown. If it was proceeds from illegal activity, the situation was far more complicated. She needed to know everything I could tell her about Richard's business history before she could advise me on the next step. I told her everything I knew, which I realized as I spoke was far less than I should have known after 31 years. Patricia's first action was to order a discrete asset search on Richard's name, a legal process using public financial records, business filings, and corporate registrations. She warned me it would take 1 to 2 weeks. She also advised me, in careful and unequivocal terms, not to discuss this matter with any family members, and particularly not with Dale Collins. I drove home feeling, for the first time since the funeral, that I was standing on something solid. But Dale had apparently been watching. He called that same evening. His voice had a different texture than usual. Not the performed sympathy of the post-funeral call, but something more tightly controlled. "Maggie," he said, "Sandra and I were thinking about you. We'd like to come down this weekend, spend some time, look through Richard's office together. He had some professional papers I might be able to help you sort." Richard's office, Richard's small home office where he kept his files, where he kept his past. "That's very kind, Dale," I said, "but I'm not ready for that yet. I'll let you know." A beat. Then, "Of course. No rush at all." His voice was smooth, too smooth, the voice of a man recalibrating. The call lasted another 4 minutes of pleasantries, and when it ended, I went directly to Richard's office, sat in his chair, and began going through his files myself. I spent 3 evenings in that room. I went through every folder, every drawer. Most of it was exactly what it appeared to be: tax returns, insurance documents, home repair receipts. But in the bottom drawer, beneath a hanging file labeled Miscellaneous, I found a manila envelope that had been folded in half and secured with a rubber band. Inside was a sequence of documents that I did not fully understand at first, but that, when I spread them across the desk and read them carefully twice, began to form a picture. There were bank records, not from any bank I recognized, from an account in the Cayman Islands. There were 4 wire transfer receipts totaling just over $400,000, all dated between 2008 and 2014. There were 2 pages of what appeared to be a handwritten ledger with initials rather than names, and columns labeled simply "in" and "out." And at the bottom of the stack, there was a letter, handwritten in a script that was not Richard's, that began, "As discussed, the arrangement remains between us. D understands his role. If anything changes, we rearrange accordingly." It was unsigned, but I recognized the handwriting. I had seen it on birthday cards, on Christmas tags, on a sympathy card that had arrived the week of the funeral and sat on my mantel for 2 weeks. With deepest love, Dale and Sandra. I sat in Richard's chair with that letter in my hands and understood, with a cold, complete clarity, that Dale Collins had not called me after the funeral out of grief. He had called me because he knew about the money, because he had been part of whatever arrangement had generated it, because $2 million in a dead man's suitcase was, in Dale's mind, not mine. I photographed every document with my phone. Then I replaced everything exactly as I had found it, drove to a FedEx the next morning, and mailed the photographs to Patricia Holt's office. She called me the same afternoon. "Maggie," she said, and I noticed she had switched to my first name for the first time. "What you've sent me changes things significantly. I need you to listen carefully. Don't move anything. Don't discuss this with anyone. And I need you to come in tomorrow morning, because what we have now, this is a paper trail." A paper trail, the two most powerful words anyone had spoken to me in months. I hung up and looked out the window of my car in the FedEx parking lot. Around me, the ordinary afternoon continued without interruption. A woman loading boxes, a teenager on his phone, the smell of diesel from a passing truck. Normal life. My life, 8 months ago. I was not the same woman who had watered her neighbor's petunias. Patricia Holt moved faster than I expected. Within 4 days of my second visit to her office, she'd filed an emergency petition with the Cobb County Probate Court to have the undisclosed assets of Richard Collins' estate formally identified and protected. Tom Whitaker, to his immense credit, had agreed to act as a formal witness and custodian of the suitcase pending court authorization. Patricia had him sign a notarized affidavit documenting exactly how and when he discovered the false bottom, what the contents appeared to be, and the fact that he had not disturbed them. A court-appointed representative was scheduled to inventory the cash the following week. The asset search Patricia had commissioned came back on the same day. Richard Collins had been a silent partner in a shell company registered in Delaware, established in 2005, which had in turn been involved in a series of real estate and distribution ventures that were currently under review by the IRS, according to the search firm's language. The company had 2 listed principals, Richard Collins and one Dale A. Collins. So there it was, Richard and Dale, together. For years. I had been the furniture in my own marriage. Present, useful, unexamined. Had Richard ever looked at me across the dinner table and felt guilty? Had he ever come close to telling me? Or had the secret become so old that it stopped feeling like a secret and simply became part of the architecture of his life? I did not have answers to those questions. I suspected I never would. What I had, instead, were documents, a lawyer, and a court filing. And it was the court filing that shook Dale Collins out of whatever patience he had been maintaining. He appeared at my door on a Tuesday evening, unannounced. Sandra was with him. Dale's face, ordinarily pleasant in a practiced way, was carrying something different tonight. A tension around the jaw, a flatness in the eyes that I associated with men who have realized a situation has gone beyond their control. "We need to talk," he said. I let them in, because I had Patricia's explicit advice in my mind. Do not refuse contact. Do not escalate. Document everything. I had my phone in my pocket, recording. We sat in the living room. Dale sat forward in the armchair, Richard's armchair, with his elbows on his knees, which I recognized as his posture for when he believed he was the smartest person in a room. "Maggie," he said, "we heard you filed something with the probate court about assets." "My lawyer filed a routine petition related to the estate," I said. "Standard procedure." "We heard about a suitcase," Sandra said. Her voice was perfectly level, which somehow made it more unpleasant than if she'd been emotional. "You should speak with my attorney if you have questions about the estate," I said. Dale leaned forward another inch. "Maggie, let's be honest with each other. Richard and I had an arrangement, a business arrangement, going back years. That money represents returns on investments we both made. It is not solely part of his estate. I have a legal interest in it." "Then I'd encourage you to contact Patricia Holt's office," I said. "She can be reached at—" "Maggie." His voice dropped. "I am asking you as family not to do this. You don't know what you're opening. You don't know the kind of people Richard and I dealt with. If this goes into a court process, it draws attention that could be very uncomfortable. For you." A pause that was clearly intended to be meaningful. For Brenna and Daniel. There it was. He had mentioned my children. I felt something go very quiet inside me. Not fear exactly, but a kind of compressed calm, the way the air changes before a storm. "Dale," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my own voice was. "I want to be clear. You just implied a threat to my children in my living room." I reached into my pocket and set my phone on the coffee table between us, screen up, the recording timestamp visible. "My attorney advised me to document all contact. I've been recording this conversation since you arrived. That recording will be preserved as part of the estate proceedings." The silence that followed was the best silence I have ever heard. Sandra looked at Dale. Dale looked at the phone. He sat back in the chair, slowly, precisely, and I watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. "We were just expressing concern," Sandra said, her voice now carrying a careful brightness, like someone switching on a lamp in a dark room. "Of course," I said. "I appreciate the concern. My attorney will be in touch." I stood. They left. I closed the front door, pressed my back against it, and breathed. I called Patricia immediately. She listened to my account and said she would escalate to the probate judge's office first thing in the morning, flagging the interaction as potential witness intimidation. She also strongly suggested I install a security camera at my front door, which I did the following day, using a service my neighbor's son recommended. Then I did something I had not allowed myself in 8 months of grief and revelation and fear. I drove to Lake Allatoona on Thursday morning, checked into a small lakeside cabin I'd found online, and spent 3 days doing almost nothing. I walked in the mornings. I sat on the porch in the afternoons. I read the novel that had been sitting unopened on my nightstand since July. I ate soup and grilled cheese sandwiches and went to bed before 9. I was not the same Maggie who had tagged that suitcase with a $15 sticker. But I needed to remember what it felt like to simply breathe before the next round came. And it would come. I knew that. I came home from the lake on a Sunday evening to find a large arrangement of white lilies on my front porch. The card read, "Maggie, thinking of you always. Let's find a peaceful resolution for Richard's sake. Dale and Sandra." I photographed the card. I forwarded the photograph to Patricia. I put the flowers in the trash. For Richard's sake. As if Richard were a shared value now, a piece of common ground Dale could claim whenever the directness of a threat became inconvenient. That was how manipulative people operated, I was learning. They shuffled between roles without friction, moving from intimidation to sentiment to wounded family feeling, depending on which tool seemed most likely to work. I had spent 57 years believing that decency was the natural state of most people, and that cruelty required some extraordinary motivation. I was revising that belief. What I felt standing there on my porch in the early autumn dark was not fear. It was something colder, and more useful, a kind of clarity. 3 days at the lake had given me distance, and distance had given me perspective. The situation, stripped of its emotional weight, was actually straightforward. I was the primary heir to Richard's estate. The money, whatever its origins, had been in Richard's possession. Patricia was building the legal scaffolding to protect my claim while the IRS and potentially the FBI sorted out the origin question. Dale's claim, that the money represented his share of a joint business arrangement, was an argument he was welcome to make in court using documents, with lawyers, where recording devices were unnecessary because everything was already on the record. Dale did not want to go to court. That was the entire point. The Tuesday after I returned, he called. His voice had shifted register again, warmer this time, almost brotherly. "Maggie, I owe you an apology. Sandra and I came over the other night and I said some things in a way that came across wrong. I was stressed. I wasn't thinking clearly. You know how much Richard meant to me. I'm grieving too." "I understand," I said. "I just think there's a way to handle this without lawyers and courts and making it ugly. Richard would have hated that. You know he would have. He always said family was everything." Family was everything. I thought about the offshore account, the shell company, the years of silence across the dinner table. "Dale," I said, "I have tremendous respect for the grief you're experiencing, but I've retained legal counsel, and I'm going to follow her guidance. If you'd like to make any formal proposals regarding the estate, you're welcome to have your attorney contact Patricia Holt. That's the appropriate channel." I paused. "I wish you well." I ended the call before he could respond. I sat for a moment afterward with the phone in my lap, aware of something that felt almost like satisfaction. Not triumph. It was too early for that. But the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has finally learned to say no without explaining herself or apologizing for it. It was my friend Carol Hendricks who gave me something I hadn't realized I needed: ordinary human warmth. Carol and I had been friends since our daughters were in the same kindergarten class, which made it 28 years of Tuesday lunches and shared grievances and the particular ease of someone who knows you too well to perform anything for. I had not told her about the suitcase. Patricia's advice had been unambiguous, but I had told her that I was dealing with some complicated estate issues involving Dale Collins and that it was taking a toll. Carol arrived at my house on a Wednesday evening with a container of her chicken tortilla soup, a bottle of decent Chardonnay, and the focused attention of a woman who has seen her friend through cancer, scares and a son's DUI, and a flooded basement. We sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours. She didn't press for details. She said, "You look like you've been carrying something very heavy." And I said, "I have." And she nodded and refilled my glass. She told me about her granddaughter's first week of school and her husband Frank's obsessive new interest in woodworking and the plot of a television series she was watching. And by the end of the evening, I had laughed 3 times genuinely, which felt extraordinary. Before she left, she held my hands across the table and looked at me with the directness she had always had. "You're tougher than you think you are, Maggie Collins," she said. "You always have been. You just didn't know it because you never needed to be before." I held those words for a long time after the door closed. I also, quietly, without drama, reached out to my daughter Brenna that week. Not with the full story. I told her there were complications with her father's estate that I was handling with an attorney, that I was fine, that I would explain everything when the process was further along. She pushed back once, "Mom, I can come down, I can help." And I told her firmly but warmly that the best thing she could do was trust me. After a moment, she said, "Okay." 2 letters, but they steadied me for days. And then, on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after I'd returned from the lake, Patricia called with an update. The court-appointed representative had formally inventoried the cash in Tom Whitaker's custody, $2,143,000, documented and preserved as a probate asset. The IRS had been formally notified as required by law. Patricia had also, through channels I didn't fully understand, confirmed that Richard's name had appeared in a 2019 federal investigation into a distribution network that had used cash-intensive business fronts, an investigation that had been closed without charges due to insufficient evidence. Which means, Patricia said carefully, that the money's existence is not automatically criminal evidence. The origin is murky. But murky is workable. Murky, we can argue. And Dale? I asked. Dale's attorney contacted my office yesterday, she said. He is preparing to assert a claim. Let him, I said. I surprised myself with how level I sounded. They came on a Saturday afternoon in November when the leaves on the oak tree in my backyard had turned fully and the air smelled of wood smoke from somewhere down the street. I saw the car in my driveway from the kitchen window, Dale's silver Cadillac, which he had driven for years with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes a certain kind of car says something irrefutable about him. I took a breath. I straightened my cardigan. I pressed record on my phone and slid it into my front pocket. When I opened the door, Sandra was smiling in a way I had never seen from her before. Something softer, more deliberate, as if she had practiced it. She was carrying a pound cake in a glass dish covered in plastic wrap. Lemon pound cake. My own recipe, which she had apparently obtained at some point without my knowledge. The calculation of it was almost impressive. "Maggie," she said, "we were in the neighborhood. We just wanted to... Could we come in? Just for a few minutes. Family." I stepped aside and let them in. We sat in the living room. Sandra set the pound cake on the coffee table. Dale did not sit forward this time. He sat back, deliberately relaxed, one ankle crossed over his knee, performing ease. He was wearing a sport coat. Sandra had on pearl earrings. They had dressed for this. "Maggie," Dale began, "we want to start over. We genuinely do. I know the last few weeks have been difficult, and I take responsibility for some of that. I came to you in a way that wasn't right, and I'm sorry for it. I want you to know that." "Thank you," I said. "We've been talking a lot," Sandra said, leaning forward slightly, her hands folded in her lap in a gesture of sincerity so studied it looked like a word problem. "And we think there's a path here that doesn't involve courts and attorneys and all of this. Ugliness. A path that honors Richard and honors the family he built." "I'm listening," I said. Dale cleared his throat. "The truth is, and I should have said this differently the first time, Richard and I built something together over many years. That money represents both of our work, our risk. And I'm not asking you to take my word for it, Maggie. I have records, documents." He paused. "What I'm asking is whether you'd be willing to discuss a private settlement, something that keeps this between family, avoids public proceedings, avoids complications. For you and the kids, you'd be taken care of, generously. You'd be taken care of." I let the phrase sit in the air for a moment. "How generously?" I asked. My voice was neutral. I was genuinely curious how low his number would be. Dale named a figure, $300,000, out of $2 million. His face held the expression of a man presenting a very reasonable offer. I looked at him. I looked at Sandra. I looked at the pound cake, my recipe in her dish, sitting on my coffee table like a prop in a small, well-rehearsed play. "Dale," I said slowly, "I want to make sure I understand the proposal. You're suggesting I accept $300,000 of an asset that may be valued at over $2 million, forgo legal proceedings, keep everything private, and do all of this. Why exactly? What is the benefit to me of keeping it private?" A small hesitation. "It keeps the family name clean," Sandra said carefully. "The family name," I repeated. "And," Dale said, his voice lowering just slightly, "it avoids scrutiny of personal details. Details about Richard's life that might be difficult for the children to hear. Business decisions, choices he made that you might not have known about." There it was, underneath the pound cake and the pearl earrings and the soft apology. A threat. Not a threat against my safety this time, but something more intimate. The threat of my children's image of their father. "Accept our terms, or we'll tell them things that will break the version of Richard they carry." I looked at my hands in my lap for a moment. Was I frightened? Yes. Not of Dale's legal chances. Patricia had been clear on those. But of the other thing he was suggesting. Because what did I actually know about what Richard had done? How deep did it go? If Dale had documents, his own documents, his version of events, what story could he tell? What could he expose that I was still, even now, unable to fully see? But then I thought of something Patricia had told me in our second meeting. The best protection against someone using the truth as a weapon is to already know the truth yourself. Whatever Richard had done, I was not responsible for it. My children were not responsible for it. And a man who would threaten to damage my children's memory of their father in order to reclaim money he had hidden offshore was not a man with a legitimate claim to anything. "Dale," I said, and I was astonished by my own steadiness. "I'm not going to accept that offer. I'm going to see this through the legal process. If you have documents supporting a claim, your attorney can present them to Patricia Holt and to the court. That's the right way to do this." The room changed. Dale's relaxed posture dissolved. He sat forward, back to the original position, elbows on knees, the pretense of ease gone. His jaw was tight. Sandra's smile had not exactly disappeared, but it had gone somewhere inward, somewhere cold. "You're making a mistake," Dale said. "Not a threat this time. A statement. Flat as concrete." "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life," I said. "I've accepted things I shouldn't have, believed things without asking questions. This is me not doing that anymore." Dale stood. Sandra stood. She picked up the pound cake from the coffee table, a small, instinctive reclamation, and I had to press my lips together to prevent something that might have looked like amusement. "Don't come back without calling first," I said as I walked them to the door. "I'd appreciate the courtesy." They left without another word. I closed the door, leaned against it, and let myself feel the fear properly. My hands were trembling. My heart was moving faster than it should have. I was a 57-year-old woman from Marietta, Georgia, who used to bake lemon pound cake for the church sale, and I was standing at the center of something that had been constructed over decades and hidden from me, and now required me to be someone I had not known I was capable of being. The fear was real, but underneath it was something else, something that grew each time I said no and the ceiling didn't fall. A woman can be afraid and resolute at the same time. I was learning that. I called Patricia and gave her the summary. "Good," she said. "We'll add it to the record. And Maggie, the hearing is in 3 weeks. We're ready." The Cobb County probate hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. Tuesday had always been my book club day, my ordinary day, and there was something grounding about that. The courthouse was not dramatic in the way courts appear on television. It was a practical building with fluorescent lighting and plastic chairs, and the particular smell of institutional carpet and photocopier toner. I wore my navy dress and low heels. I had slept surprisingly well the night before. Patricia met me in the corridor at 8:15 with her briefcase and an expression of focused calm. "Ready?" she said. "Remarkably," I said. Dale and Sandra arrived with their attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who had the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to winning through volume. He was silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of lawyer Dale would have chosen because he looked expensive and certain. Dale himself was in a dark suit and had the controlled expression of a man who believes he is about to win. He met my eyes across the corridor. I held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. Not from weakness, from simple disinterest in the performance he was giving. The hearing was before Judge Anita Chambers, a woman in her late 50s with close-cropped gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the brisk economy of someone who has heard every possible human story and remained committed to the facts. Gerald Foss opened Dale's case with considerable energy. He argued that the estate cash represented returns from a legitimate joint business venture between Richard Collins and Dale Collins, that Dale had contributed capital, strategy, and labor to the enterprise over 19 years, that he possessed financial records demonstrating these contributions, and that as a co-investor, he held a rightful claim to 50% of the discovered assets. He was confident. He was fluent. He used the phrase, "in good faith," 4 times. Then Patricia rose. "Your Honor," she said, "we do not dispute that Dale Collins and Richard Collins had a business relationship. The question before this court is the nature of that relationship, the source of the funds, and whether Mr. Collins's claim can be substantiated by documents that will withstand scrutiny." She placed before the court 3 items. First, the Cayman Islands bank records I had found in Richard's files, showing 4 wire transfers between 2008 and 2014, each originating from a domestic LLC that had been dissolved in 2016 with no tax filings for its final 3 operational years. Second, a certified letter from the IRS confirming that the LLC in question, the same Delaware shell company in which Dale Collins had been a listed principal, was currently under review as part of a broader audit of cash-intensive businesses in the southeastern United States. Third, Tom Whitaker's notarized affidavit, given in full, describing the discovery of the false bottom and the unbroken state of the contents, establishing that the cash had been in Richard's possession, secured for an unknown period of time, and that there was no documentation linking any portion of it to Dale Collins's direct investment. "Mr. Collins claims he contributed capital to a joint venture," Patricia said. "We ask the court to require him to demonstrate, with documentation, what specific funds he transferred, when, to what account, and how those funds connect to the specific cash now held in estate custody. A verbal claim of partnership is not sufficient to establish ownership of an undocumented asset of this magnitude." Gerald Foss rose to object, and what followed was approximately 45 minutes of procedural argument that I will not pretend to have followed in its entirety. What I could follow was the judge's face, and Judge Chambers was paying very close attention to Patricia's documentation. Then Gerald Foss made his error. In arguing that Dale's records were sufficient to establish partnership, he submitted 3 pages of what he characterized as internal business records, handwritten ledger entries, which he claimed showed Richard and Dale's co-investments. Patricia examined them. She looked at them for a longer moment than seemed necessary. Then she asked permission to approach the bench. She showed the judge something I could not see from where I sat. "Your Honor," Patricia said, "the handwritten records submitted by Mr. Collins's counsel are dated between 2009 and 2013. However, the paper stock on which they are written bears a watermark that was not used by this manufacturer until 2018. She placed a document on the judge's desk, a certification from a document analysis firm she had commissioned 2 weeks earlier, based on copies Dale's attorney had been legally obligated to disclose in the pre-hearing discovery process. These records appear to have been created recently and backdated. The silence in that courtroom was unlike any silence I have experienced. Gerald Foss said, "Your Honor, we dispute—" "Counsel," Judge Chambers said, in a voice that required no elevation to carry absolute authority, "you will be quiet." I looked at Dale. His face, for the first time since I had known him, showed something unguarded. Not anger exactly. Something more like a man who has been standing on a floor he believed solid and has just felt it shift. Sandra was beside him, perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Her expression had gone entirely neutral, the blankness of a woman who has decided there is nothing left worth performing. "Mr. Collins," the judge said directly to Dale, "are you prepared to address the authentication of these documents?" Dale's attorney leaned close to him. They exchanged whispers. Dale's jaw was working. I watched him try to locate the certainty he had walked in with and find that it had gone somewhere he couldn't reach. "Your Honor," Gerald Foss finally said, "my client would like to request a continuance to—" "Denied," said Judge Chambers. "We'll proceed." "We'll proceed." Those 2 words were the most beautiful words I had ever heard inside a building. Patricia had more. She had always had more. She presented the recording from Dale and Sandra's living room visit, which under Georgia law was admissible as a one-party consent recording, in which Dale had explicitly stated that the money represented returns on investments we both made, and had suggested that private settlement would help avoid complications and scrutiny of personal details. The judge listened to a 2-minute excerpt with the particular stillness of someone building a conclusion. When Patricia sat down, I was looking at my own hands in my lap. They were perfectly steady. Was this what justice felt like? Not thunder, not revelation, just paperwork and silence and a judge writing on a yellow legal pad. Judge Chambers did not rule from the bench that day. She recessed and issued her written ruling 11 days later. I read it at my kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, coffee gone cold beside me and Carol sitting across from me, because I had finally told her everything, and she had sat with her hands over her mouth for 4 minutes, then said, "Maggie Collins, you remarkable woman," and driven straight over. The finding was clear. Dale Collins had failed to produce credible documentation establishing any legal claim to the discovered assets. The submitted ledger records were referred to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation for forensic examination. His claim was dismissed in its entirety. The $2,143,000 was formally recognized as an undisclosed asset of Richard Collins' estate, with Margaret Collins as primary heir. As a consequence of the mandatory IRS notification, the dissolved LLC was flagged for a full federal audit. Patricia explained that the origin question would likely remain partially unresolved, but there was a meaningful legal distinction between funds proven to be criminal proceeds and funds that were simply undocumented. Practically, this meant half the funds, just over $1 million, would be released to me immediately, with the remainder held in a court-supervised account pending the audit. I accepted that the full amount might never be entirely mine. That was acceptable. I had not needed $2 million. I had needed justice. As for Dale, within 6 weeks he received a formal target letter from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Gerald Foss withdrew as his attorney. The criminal defense specialist Dale retained consumed the majority of his liquid savings within the first month. His house went on the market in January. Sandra left in February, not out of solidarity with me, but because Sandra had always been doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic had changed. I called Tom Whitaker the day the ruling was issued. "Mr. Whitaker," I said, "what you did, calling me, telling me the truth, holding that suitcase exactly as you found it, changed my life. A less honest man could have kept it. You didn't." He was quiet a moment. "I was raised by a woman who would have come back to haunt me personally if I'd behaved any other way," he said, and I could hear the smile in it. We laughed. It was the first full laugh I'd had since before the garage sale. I signed the final paperwork on a bright January morning in Patricia's office. Driving home afterward, I passed my exit for Clover Street and kept going, past the lake, past the old park where Richard and I had hiked once, a memory that now lived in a more complicated place than it once had. I drove until I was ready to stop. Then I drove home. I sold the house on Clover Street in March. It wasn't bitterness. I had loved that street for 24 years, but the house carried a knowing I no longer wanted layered into its walls. I bought a smaller place in Reynoldstown with a porch and south-facing kitchen windows and a good bookstore within walking distance. I told my children the full story in February. Brenna cried. Daniel went very quiet. I told them directly, Richard had not been only the thing he had hidden. Human beings contain their failures alongside everything else. The IRS audit concluded 14 months later. After all fees and settlements, I received roughly $960,000. But what changed my life more than the money was what happened to me while fighting for it. I went back to volunteering, reading tutoring at a local elementary school twice a week. I joined a new book club. Carol drove to Atlanta once a month. Tom Whitaker and I exchanged Christmas cards. Dale was living in a rental apartment in Smyrna. Sandra had relocated to Savannah. I didn't spend time imagining their lives. I spent time imagining my own. On a Saturday the following September, I sat on my new porch with coffee and a novel, the Atlanta light falling